Welcome, brothers, sisters, fellow travelers. My name is Joel and this is Good Crazy. I've mentioned previously how Jesus referred to snares being in his kingdom. That is to say, in all of Christendom, there have been things that we might have thought were safe that actually caused us harm. And one of these other snares that I'd like to talk about is the snare of judging or judgment. And it's a perfect example of how we might think of it as okay or benign, but it actually keeps us from following the commands of Jesus. Because in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he gives us a very clear direction: do not judge. And he doesn't give qualifications as to why or when it might be okay to judge. He just tells us, do not judge. But so many Christians have heard that message and felt that it was okay to ignore it for one reason or another. And there are at least two major reasons that people excuse themselves to go ahead and judge. One of which is they say it's impossible, right? We all judge. It's not possible not to judge. And that seems like a reasonable argument because we all have critical thinking skills. We can't help but analyze the things around us and maybe on some level make judgment calls. But is that what Jesus is actually talking about? When he gives us that command, do not judge, he follows it with an example. He says, how can you say to your brother, let me remove the straw from your eye? So he's talking about looking at another individual and seeing them as having a defect that we believe we're capable of removing. So judging involves evaluating another person. And that's really how, even in our modern life, judging is used when there's a judge in a courtroom. He's there potentially to determine guilt and to pass sentence on a person. When there's a judge at a talent show, they have to evaluate maybe on a scale of 1 to 10 or good or bad. They're deciding how to evaluate another person. And so to bring that to a more practical example, we could think of smoking cigarettes, which is something that, at least from a scientific point of view, is not good for our health, right? And we might be able to say, well, that's bad. But the more a person understands a situation, the more nuanced they realize everything is. Like if smoking were only bad, why would anyone smoke? Right? They are getting something out of smoking, whether that's social benefits from meeting, with other smokers and hanging out, or whether that's the specific effects of nicotine, which they enjoy. So there are good things that they are enjoying, even if overall it might be bad for their health. But the point is, it's less black and white and more gray. And more importantly, even if we may not choose to smoke ourselves, to look at another person who smokes and say, you're a bad person because you smoke cigarettes. That is what Jesus is talking about. To evaluate another person as good or bad based on what they do is what he is cautioning us, warning us not to do. And we could take that to another example, say murder. Well, I think we could all say that murder is certainly something that God told us not to do. It ought to be viewed as something that's bad. At the same time, we don't know the circumstances of every particular person who has gone to that length, who has murdered someone else. We don't know the situation they were in, whether it was self-defense, what they had been through up to that point. So once again, we might in our own life say, I'm going to do everything I can not to do something terrible like that. But how can I say that someone else is definitely a bad person when I don't know the full circumstances of what they've been through or of that particular circumstance? That is what he's warning us against. And that brings me to the second excuse that people often make when it comes to judging, which is that, well, as long as I judge correctly, then I'm okay. then there's no problem. But that's again not what Jesus said. He said, do not judge. He didn't say, well, if you're a particular person who judges correctly, then it's okay. He just warned us not to judge. Why? Well, think about Jesus. Jesus, at least according to the Gospels, was able to read people's thoughts and their heart condition without them saying out loud what they were thinking. He could tell. It's a miraculous ability that no other humans have. Similarly, when he talked to the Samaritan woman at the well, he already knew her past experiences. He knew that she'd been married 5 times and that the person that she was currently with, she was not married to. And to which, she immediately thought, well, I perceive you're a prophet, because normal humans can't do things like that. So we might well ask ourselves, right? If I don't know the history of a particular person and I can't read their heart, how could I possibly think that I could judge someone correctly? Really and truly, only God is capable of making that level of judgment because he knows us, like Jesus said, he knows even the number of hairs on our head. He knows everything about us, every detail about us. And isn't that who we would want to judge us? Because I don't know about you, but I feel like, at least in my case, and this is probably true for most people, we've all done things that if people just knew the circumstances around the mistake we made, they might think we're awful. But if they understood the bigger picture, if they really knew us, our history, our heart condition, then they might feel differently. That's why we would obviously want it to be God that judges us. And so Jesus is warning us, commanding us not to judge, not because he's trying to take something away from us, but because he knows we are not capable of making accurate judgments about other people. And when we make judgments about other people, it actually negatively affects us. When you think about, there are often people who say, well, I only judge other people as harshly as I judge myself, right? And that is their excuse, well, I only expect out of other people what I expect of myself. And they think of that as a positive thing. But in reality, that sort of self judgment is also really harmful to us, right? Because once again, even though we believe that we know our full history and that we know our heart condition, we are often judging even ourselves from a lens that is actually very harsh. But God, the God of love, views us as his children and views us in a very merciful way. And so ultimately, I believe that the command of Jesus to not judge is something that is a protection against us. If you've ever been, as I have been, raised or were raised in a religion where you were taught that it was okay to judge, and that was the case for me. I grew up in a religion where there were like judicial committees formed to meet with people who they believed had committed grave sins to decide whether they were repentant or not. If you've ever been part of something like that, you know how painful it can be in retrospect to think about how you treated that other person just based on the little information that you had about them. And so to me, it's a protection from Jesus to say, do not judge, let that go. See how so many people do the things they do because of the circumstances in which they were raised, because of the circumstances that they were in the moment, because their emotions were flared up and they had difficulty controlling them. And we've all been there. We've all been in situations where we had difficulty keeping our cool and where our past life circumstances influenced our current decisions. And so when you let that go, it is such a freeing experience to see everyone as a child of God and capable of changing. And as long as they're alive, even if they've done things that are harmful to others and horrible in many ways, that they are still capable of turning things around. And that, if anything, is even I feel like that is the example that the rest of the Bible gives us, that there are people like Manasseh, the king of Judah, who did terrible things, but ultimately changed at the end of his life. Or people like Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times directly, essentially in front of him, and was still forgiven. That is the beauty of the forgiveness of God, the kind of mercy that we should extend to everybody, not knowing what they've been through and where they're going. So I hope that you can see too how judging ultimately becomes a snare, because we might feel that we're very intelligent, that we're capable of making those decisions, but ultimately he warns us not to do it because it protects us from hurting our own heart and for hurting other people.
Until next time, may you know love, may you have peace, and may the truth set you free.